Hello and welcome to Dialogue. The third International Forum on Democracy, the Shared Human Values, kicked off in Beijing on Wednesday, with nearly 300 officials and experts from 70 countries and regions discussing how to realize democracy in the modern and digital age. What are the highlights of the forum? How should the countries handle each other in a time of uncertainty? What about the Belt and Road projects in Greece? Joining me today is Professor George Katrougalos, former Foreign Minister of Greece. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to Dialogue, Mr. Katrougalos. Whatever forms, the ultimate test of a democratic form is whether it delivers, whether it responds to the need of the people. In that respect, how do you see the Chinese-style democratic practice? If you look at the Chinese development.
You're absolutely right. It is not important what you promise, but what you deliver. Therefore, I again referred to my speech at the international surveys, all of them not by Chinese, but by Western institutions, that show that there is a high level of trust of the Chinese people to their government. Actually, China has the biggest, let's say, trust, the highest trust among all other countries in the world. And there is a huge discrepancy between this high level of trusts, sometimes around 90%, and the much lower levels of trusts that exist in the Western democracies. Of course, that I believe it's a telling, because one essential difference between autocracies and democracies is that autocratic regimes are based on coercion or violence. Democratic regimes are based on trust.
Based on the trust, of course, there are reasons why people have shown this high level of trust in the Chinese government. Of course, it's easy to point out the fact that the rapid development of China over the past 40 plus years.
It is not just economic development. Of course, there is a historic achievement, taking out of poverty 750 million people. But there is another, maybe more important indicator. United Nations have a development index that does not reflect only economic performance, but also qualitative indicators such as inequalities, education, expectancy of life. China is the only country that almost doubled its development index. It was in the 1990 less than 5% out of 10. Now it's at 8. That looks society that knows that it goes forwards. Problem in the West is exactly that because of the huge inequalities that our societies face, we have the exactly opposite feeling. I usually say that we are the first generation of Europeans, and that could extend to all Western countries, that we fear that our children are going to have a worse life than ours. And this is not because we have less wealth now in our societies, we have much more wealth than in the 60s. The distribution of the wealth is problematic. It goes just to the 1% of the richest part of our population. And that, of course, does not create only huge social inequalities, it undermines political trust.
Well, of course, because of China's rapid development, there's a sense, in at least some countries, let's say, established powers, let's say, like the U.S., there's a sense of anxiety. China is catching up. Some politician would say, like, I don't like to name the names, but the U.S. Commerce Secretary said that we need to work with the EU to slow down the Chinese innovation. I wonder what's your response to such remarks like
It is interesting. There is a famous American professor and author, Graham Allison, who's speaking about Thucydides' trap. He's reflecting about the rise of Athens during the 5th century before Christ and its rivalry with Sparta, which used to be at the time the dominant power. Allison's argument is that every time that we have a rising power, like now China, the established superpower, now the United States, is feeling anxious. And sometimes, he says, this could result to war. Contrary to what we usually think if we have not read the book, Allison does not believe that war is inevitable. Quite the contrary. And also he tries to explain to the American audience that China essentially is not an aggressive and militaristic country. It's very interesting that one of the chapters of the book describes what the United States have done to their own American states, different than their own, Mexico, Latin America, and it has a famous phrase, I cannot remember it exactly, but says, imagine if the Chinese have done what we have done, what we were saying. Therefore, I believe that we must have a much better understanding of the Chinese political system, of the Chinese history through the centuries, in order to understand what actually is happening. Besides that, of course, there are economic rivalries. There are many dominant industries in the Western world, especially, for instance, car industries, that they are worried about the rise of the Chinese ingenuity. Because some years ago, many people in the West believed that China is just a producer of cheap products. A big factory, yes, but a factory of non-essential goods. Now we see that in many fields, electronic vehicles, but also artificial intelligence, China is making a huge progress. In some of these areas must be maybe ahead of the Western countries.
You talked about China and Greece. I wonder how you look at the relationship so far, over the past decades, and the financial crisis about 10 years ago.
We are grateful to China because during our economic crisis, tried to help. China was the only country who was buying Greek bonds in a period where we had real difficulties. And then again, with Piraeus, we had a very strong, let's say, cooperation. When the left has been in government, Greece has become the 17th state in this 16+1 system of economic cooperation that used to exist and it still exists in Central Europe. The actual government of Greece, which of more, let's say, conservative, is not so much enthusiastic in that, but nobody believes that China and Greece are not going to have a very good shared economic future.
The French President Macron has talked about, there are no red lines for France or for other European countries to support Ukraine. And the latest had that, the general are talking about preparing to join the Ukrainian or sending troops to Ukraine side to join the battle. Others, have fears about are we getting closer to a World War III or a large...
But any kind of further escalation is dangerous. A third world war would be a disaster for all humanity. It's not something that we must easily contemplate. I have been a leader of the European left at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe till recently, till last October. Our point there, exactly because we believe that Europe must have its own foreign policy, our point there that Europe should promote a plan for peace in Ukraine. Because till now we have ideas coming for peace from China, from Brazil, even from Saudi Arabia, but we do not have a European plan. Because Europe now has much worse economic conditions for its development than in the past because of the price of energy. Only the United States are having gains from this, let's say, new situation in Ukraine regarding their energy, which is sold in Europe in much higher prices, for many reasons. For Ukraine, for the humanity, for Europe, I believe that we need very urgently a plan for peace in Ukraine. Of course, for not getting misunderstood, in line with the United Nations Charter, that is the principle of sovereignty, territorial integrity, that also very important rules that we must safeguard.
Mm-hmm. Back to democracy, there's the third edition of a global summit on democracy in South Korea. They talked about, in a way, ideological differences, Western democracy versus autocracy, us versus them. Some people, many people actually, have this concern that are we seeing a divided world, like what happened during
This
the
is a
Cold
nice
War?
point. Of course, there are ideological differences. Politics is based on contradiction of different political ideas and perceptions of the society. But this is quite different than wanting to go back to a bipolar world. I don't think that there is any place for such new divisions of the world, exactly because now we live in a much more complicated and more multi-dimensional, let's say, world than in the past.
Oh, what should we do? You know, as a member of the international community, we may have different forms of democracy, but democracy is a shared value. In what way we can cooperate more, probably, rather than seeing, distancing from each other?
But continue to discuss. You know that in the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, there is a so-called special procedure about which calling for a new, more democratic and more equitable international order. This is a duty of all countries to discuss without naming and shaming, with a concept of cooperation, of harmonious cooperation, as you say, in China, how we can achieve at least mutual understanding, because our differences are not going to disappear. Some of these differences reflect different ideas, some reflect different interests, so they're going to be there. The important thing is not to escalate to conflicts, and because a conflict in our era of nuclear wars, of artificial intelligence, could mean disaster, catastrophe for the humankind.
I mean, and we have this common challenge of climate change and the transborder crimes, nuclear threats, of course. We need to work together.
Of course.
More dialogues.
More dialogue, and not the spirit of confrontation, the spirit of, let's say, coexistence, peaceful dialogue.
Peaceful dialogue, coexistence. Thank you, Mr. Katrougalos.
It was a pleasure.
For talking to us.
It was a pleasure.
Earlier, I spoke to Daniela Babeva, former Deputy Prime Minister of Bulgaria. She shared with us her understanding of democracy and how Chinese democracy delivers. She also helped shed light on bilateral ties between China and Bulgaria and how relations between China and the EU continues to evolve.